Marc, Ben, welcome so much. And thank you for coming in, particularly to do video, which we don't do a huge amount of, but it's I felt it was worth doing for this particular conversation. How are you, Marc?
Good. Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Well, Thank you. Looking forward to it.
We normally say to guests, don't worry about introducing yourselves. I'll do that in the intro, but on video, we don't quite have the same style. So, Marc, if I start with you, could you just maybe introduce yourself and your current role?
Sure. Marc Geal. I work at SAP. I'm part of our development leadership team for a product called Business Data Cloud. And I have responsibility for what I call product technology and experience, which is a lot of the cross products. So partnerships is one, hence the discussion today with you guys, but also UX and the architecture of that product, amongst other things.
Fantastic. Well, you say it in a very understated way, but it sounds incredibly impressive, broad, and quite big. So I will give it the big up there. And Ben, for yourself?
Yeah, sure. So Ben Holloway, I'm the Senior Director for our business development with partnerships, including SAP. So I've looked after SAP for the last 2 years now. I've been working closely with Marc and his team around our Business Data Cloud partnership and the work that Moody's and SAP is bringing to the market.
Fantastic. And not everyone will know, but congratulations on that, Senior Director.
Cheers. Thank you
very
very
well
much.
Earned, and we'll publicly announce it here.
Cheers.
By the time this video goes out, everyone will know anyway. Marc, I'm going to give you a real easy question to start with, but it was one where I actually had to quickly just check in with myself. So I thought other people might not know exactly what SAP actually stands for, because everyone knows the name, the brand, but what does it mean?
That's a good question. I don't know. No. Do you want it in German or do you want it in English? No, I mean, it's systems, applications and products for data systems. So, I mean, it goes back to the heritage of SAP, building essentially accounting platforms initially, right, from a bunch of ex-IBMers. So systems, applications and product.
Very good. Does what it says on the tin. And SAP is a massive business, right? That's why everyone will have heard of the brand and the acronym, and now they know what it really means. But Business Data Cloud, that's a newer one, and BDC, a newer acronym. Where does that sit within the whole of SAP?
It's a good question. I mean, traditionally, SAP is known for its application portfolio. So really running major customers' organizations, right? Whether it's their finance systems, their HR systems, their procurement systems. About 12 years ago, we started to build out platform capabilities. So allowing customers to innovate and really start to look at where they had adjacencies to their core sort of product requirements or core application requirements. And then over the last sort of 2-3 years, we've really been looking at how do we expand that into data? How do we leverage the fact that a lot of customers' core transactional data, core business data resides in an SAP system, and they now want to do new things with that data. And this is where Business Data Cloud comes in, where with our application portfolio, we standardize processes, we standardize business processes. With BDC, we want to standardize data. So it's really sort of taking a same approach that we had to applications and business processes, and now applying that to a much richer context around data. And that's Business Data Cloud.
Fantastic. And let me pivot to you, because data synonymous with what we do at Moody's. And all year since I took on this partnerships role that I've been in since January, you've been telling me how big a deal BDC is. Could you maybe share the sort of spark notes of that for those that haven't heard before?
Yeah, of course. Our partnership with SAP goes back a number of years, and we've supported a lot of our mutual strategic customers in a meaningful way through different platforms that SAP has. When BDC came to the fore, it took away all of those independent offerings that we had and brought it to the core. And as you know, with Moody's and the investment roadmap we've been making, it all comes down to that central source of data and having the full context of what we're doing. With BDC, we're able to serve a procurement use case, but also with that same data, serve a finance use case or serve a risk use case. So for Moody's and SAP, the alignment is almost naturally fit, because our roadmap is to get everything in one meaningful place, and SAP is looking to do the exact same thing with a focus on data. And that's where our partnership is naturally, I think, merged into the one track, and being able to sit next to a brand and an organization of SAP that's built around trust and a high level of reputation. That's the same core values that Moody's holds ourselves accountable for. So the alignment there culturally has also made this partnership such an easy way for us to double down and internally as well. It's everyone feels good about this partnership because there's such a strong alignment between our organizations.
And I think, the points Ben's making there are crucial, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you can't have data silos or product silos, right? I mean, you have fraud occurring with a business partner, that maybe gets recognized as part of the financial statements and as part of financial transactions. So, historically where, maybe Ariba with procurement was having a different discussion around data than our finance team, that leads to challenges for customers. And I think now by centralizing this and making, BDC that central access point, but now bringing Moody's into the mix, then you can start to ensure, much higher sort of levels of, security is maybe the wrong term, but, ensure the sort of the credibility and better manage your risk around data because it's now been centralized.
Now, that's a great segue that I'll use in just a second. I'm just going to sort of comment. It feels very much that it's in the right time as well. It's the right zeitgeist where there's some cliches, right? Data's the new oil, or data's the new gold, or these things we've seen people talk about. You don't get good AI, which we'll come on to as well, without good data. And essentially just scroll any LinkedIn feed. That's what you're going to hear about. So if you can actually make it possible to use rather than just be a piece of marketing, then I imagine that's going to be incredibly valuable for a lot of people. If we step away specifically from SAP and BDC now, people kind of have that initial understanding. Let's talk about risk, because that's what the primary listenership of this podcast working in, the risk professionals, whether that be compliance, whether that be supply chain risk or something else. How do you see the role of data specifically evolving in modern risk management, Marc? I mean, is there a way that you contextualize that for yourself and your team?
Tough question. I think the challenge we have is that we have so many different data sets, so many different interaction points that are occurring. You have an extremely complex landscape, right? And, you talk about the speed of change of data. You talk about the volume of data growing, right? So that really manifests itself in terms of creating, I think, real challenges for customers in terms of quality of data, quality, timing of getting access to the right data. And, part of, what ultimately all organizations are trying to do is to democratize that. With democratization of data comes challenges, right? I mean, organizationally, we've not been set up to democratize data, right? I mean, businesses are information hierarchies at the end of the day, right? And, data flows at a certain level and then some of it doesn't flow, right? So getting that complete picture is challenging. So I think as we think about risk holistically, or you need to now get a better understanding of that data, you need to ensure the quality and the credence of that data. And I think this is where the partnership with Moody's becomes so important, because we can start to leverage a strong set of essentially sort of well curated, well managed, and qualified data sets, right, that we can now make available to our customers in the context of their business, whether that's, managing partners, whether that's, selling product, and do that consistently, right? And I think that's game changing, I think, for many of our customers.
And going back to a point that Marc made earlier as well, the importance of knowing the customer coming into your business and where they may come in. Because at the moment, all businesses have different processes, whether it's supplier risk, customer, KYC. What we're focusing on here is that customer has that one single view across all parts of the business, and being able to break down those silos of data and disparate systems and bring it all to one actually protects the business, because the persona that comes in, everyone knows exactly what other conversations have been happening in, whether it's procurement, whether it's in finance, payments. And that's a really important part that businesses are trying to solve, because there are so many different areas where a customer comes into your business, and trying to have that centralized. And then obviously with AI, it means that you have that full context and you have the full persona as to who that customer is.
Oh, and also, is it actually the customer that it claims to be?
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
I mean, I think that's, also important in terms of now that ability to cross check and, have a degree of certainty that yes, the person that they're saying or purporting to be, they actually are.
Yeah, well, we talked before we started recording about a couple of previous episodes we've done with journalists on big scandals on this show, and it's inevitably those sort of gaps and those breakdowns and the fact that there isn't a single view in most organizations that they target. That is how they get through and navigate, maybe find a person who's willing to look the other way. And maybe the company wasn't, but that one bad actor is, or a couple of bad actors within their org. And suddenly they've got what they needed and can move onwards there, whether it's a heist or an ongoing fraud. The other example you mentioned is that fraud example. If that is spotted by the procurement team, but the compliance team can't see it, or the corporate risk management team can't see it, there's so many downstream impacts. And by the time you have the meeting and all understand it and then take mitigation action, how many weeks or months are you behind where you'd like to be? I mean, we're talking about silos. We've naturally get in there. That's going to be my next point, because there isn't a company or even a professional that I know, either in a professional sense or in, outside of work friendship, who doesn't talk about being frustrated by silos in their business or silos across departments. Why is it so difficult to break this down? And specifically with data, like, why hasn't this been solved before?
Another good question. I think there are a number of factors to that. I think one, you have this continuous tension between the business and IT in terms of, really understanding the business, the speed of delivery, which means that sometimes you get individual teams making their own decision because they think they're making a better one because their business is different, or their what they're doing requires a different set of capabilities, or just to be quicker. So I think that, in many organizations, it's true that they lose control, or IT loses some degree of control to the business, and that can lead to a fragmented nature. I think the other is even just thinking about how did companies adopt in technology. Often they move from, POC phase into pilot phase into production, and they start small and they grow, but often that ignores maybe what other teams are doing or what other parts of the business are doing as well. So, if you have different teams doing different pilots and POCs at similar times, you sort of start to build, I guess, inconsistencies into what you have within the business. I then think there's a challenge around master data and governance, right? Where it's every source system has a different way of how it, provides its taxonomy or the master data that it's creating, right? I mean, we have this challenge even within SAP where, we're moving towards a sort of a single master data model that spans across finance, HR, procurement, right? But, it's taken us 50 years to get there, or a little over 50 years to get there, right? So it's not easy because of the domain experts that you need, the fact that you on one hand need to manage this centrally, but then you need to federate within the organization. So I think, there are some cultural aspects, there are some technology aspects, and I think getting to a set of standards also around master data maybe can help in terms of now sort of proliferating a more common understanding of that data within the business.
I suppose 50 years ago as well, and even 20 years ago, there wasn't the expectation to move at the speed that we now have, that we've all become accustomed to in our consumer lives. So perhaps it wasn't as big a deal, and people were therefore willing to tolerate a level of the cross-department dysfunction because you could kind of figure it out with meetings. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think also not everything was digital, right? I mean, or at least in my generation, right? I've seen the emergence of email, right? Before that, we were still writing things in books and, doing fax machines, right? So, getting to, I think, the onset of digital, and now the fact that everything is digital, right? And it will become, I think, even more complex when we get to think about AI, right? Because now you need the context of the data with the action that you want to apply. But I just think that, we've lived through this emergence of this, let's call it end-to-end digitized supply chain. And that's now made data more prevalent and more important. But it comes in different shapes and different flavors. And now we need to try to get to a sort of more common language and a common shape for that data. And that's essentially what we're trying to do with BDC, right? I sort of mentioned that we want to standardize data. It's more standardizing the shape of data so that we can now reuse it more effectively and get more value out of it.
Is there a real customer example that have solved some of this silo challenge with BDC or that you are working on that you can anonymize but sort of share today?
I think it's still early days, right? It's not a silver bullet, right? I think many customers are still on the move, even from on-premise to the cloud. And now they're looking at how do they modify their data estate and now drive real value out of data. I think, one of the things that we're recommending to customers as we're going through this journey is not to try to re-implement what they had before. Because, I think often their analytics strategy and their data strategy wasn't necessarily fit for purpose because it was bottom up. So what we're now doing is now really looking and working with large customers that probably made a decision 4 or 5 years ago to go with one of the data platform players, the likes of a Databricks, the likes of Snowflake, the likes of, BigQuery from Google. I won't mention them all, but, the hyperscalers, Snowflake and Databricks are the ones that we often see within our customers where they're already starting to manage data essentially at a lower cost. And now we're linking into that. We're expanding our concept of a fabric and extending to the lakehouse architectures that customers have started to invest in with a Databricks or with a Snowflake or one of the hyperscalers, and now bringing all of that data together. But what we do is we apply context to that, right? So we understand the business process, we understand the hierarchy in the data. That intelligence is lost or has historically been lost when you moved it from point A to point B, right? And this is, I think you mentioned the fact that, maybe the timing is right in terms of why now. I think why now is because, you've now seen this, what we call separation of compute and storage, which means you can now bring these multi-model engines to data and drive new value, whether it's machine learning, whether it's analytical use cases. But you can now do that in context, right? And it's the context which is so important. And again, coming back to the partnership with Moody's, right? It's having that 360 view of what's important around the data, right? The supplier, the risk associated with it, other entities or counterparties that are also working with that.
Yeah, it feels like there's an element of, we talked about readiness, right? So there's a technology readiness now. There's also maybe a political will readiness that maybe, as you said, was decisions 4 or 5 years ago, but now come to fruition. And we're all incredibly impatient in today's world, or we see a decision, want to see impact, but sometimes these things take some time. One of the things you mentioned, Marc, was around the qualification of data or qualified data, if I can coin that term. And Ben, you've been working with the SAP teams on this concept of keyring. Could you maybe explain that and what it means to sort of a master data management process or program?
Yeah, of course. I'll do my absolute best. The Marc mentioned before context and being able to provide value on top of raw data. You can only do that if you can identify who the actual organization is or who the key element of that is. And that normally comes down to, in our context, a business. Now, in the past, there's always been identifiers that have been thrown around for businesses. Some are privatized and some are internal. Now, as you start to try and bring all these disparate areas of data together, you need to have a way to match those accurately with trust and confidence. And that's where this concept of keyring. It's more than a concept. It's an offering that we have, which is called keyring, which effectively allows an organization like SAP to be able to have a set of keys within their business data cloud that any third party, internal data, disparate data can come in, and you can select one of the identifiers. For example, a tax ID, a business registration ID. It could be one of your private IDs that you have. But once you bring that key in, it means that you can plug that all together and you have that one single view. And that's the most important part of our partnership, because if we don't have that single view, you effectively have what we call them, like hallucinations, because you might be talking about an organization, but it takes the context away from that organization and thinks that it's the product rather than the organization. Google is a great example. When you say, I want to understand Google, they think it's a search engine. It's like, no, we're actually about Alphabet, who's the parent company. But that is really where, because data now in organizations has become cool. Like being in data, having the best data is now something that you kind of put as a core offering and a skill that you have. the investment that we're seeing from our customers around trying to get this right is why years ago we started working so closely with SAP, because we could see that data and technology was coming together and we wanted to meet our customers where they were rather than them having to do this work around trying to pull our data into an SAP, hence where this partnership's come to.
I don't know if this is a bad analogy, you tell me, but you know those headsets you see at sort of, international summits of politicians, so like everyone can understand each other. So you've got the common translator allows you to access the conversation. Is that kind of what keyring would allow you to do?
Exactly. It's a great analogy. It's translating whatever you class as your core identifier, your core IDs into any IDs that you think other organizations may plug into. But that translator is a perfect analogy.
Okay, good. I'm glad I'm following along. Hopefully that means everyone at home is as well. Marc, we've talked actually on the podcast very recently in the last couple of months. Had an episode with Ian Godfrey, one of our subject matter experts at Moody's, on data interoperability, which I always struggle to say, so nailed it. And the need for strong data governance for that really to work. And I feel like we've kind of probably touched on some of the themes here, but I wondered if you could share how you think about the best practices of data governance and how you're looking to help organizations, which, as you said, can be incredibly complex, to make sure those are in place so they can benefit from business data cloud and all of the downstream applications.
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on it a little bit before in terms of, the concept of trust, right? So what the challenge with data often is, what actually is this data, right? Is it what it's purported to be? Is it accurate? Is it the right transaction at the right time with the right counterparty? So what we're doing now is starting to leverage a trend in the industry, which is around data products. And what's interesting about data products is really the clues in the name. It's the productization of that data, right? So for many, many years, data was accessed almost on an ad hoc basis, right? So, and often you would go back and you would, do the same query multiple times, right? And, you could never quite guarantee if it was always the same accuracy when you got that result. But by productizing data, we now make it available for reuse, but we make it available for reuse with a guarantee, essentially, that this data is what it claims to be, that it's, it's fresh, it's accurate. We've leveraged the relationship with Moody's, which we think of as enrichment, where we're enriching the data to drive additional value from a customer standpoint, and we're making it accessible so you can consume. Now, if you can do that, one, we think you can build this concept or this idea of a data products economy, but more importantly, you're giving trust to the user around that data set. It's governed properly. You have the right access rights. You're also giving the customer or the business itself the confidence that the right people are able to access that data, right? Because there's the other side of it, which is, should that person really be accessing it? And now you're associating it potentially to different use cases. Now, those use cases could be analytical, right? How has this changed over time? They could be cross-analytical or cross-LAB, what we call line of business, cross-line of business, right? So I need data that comes from finance and HR if I want to really understand the total spend that I have within my business. I also need the procurement data to understand what does that look like per partner or per product type. And then I can now also start to apply it to things like AI, machine learning, and generative use cases. And then the final one, which I think is actually very important, is you can use it for benchmarking. So now, how do I as a business compare to my peers? How do I compare to different industries? My cash management or my cash forecasting isn't what it needs to be. What does best in class look like? And now you can benchmark yourself against best in class and now try to improve as a business.
That was actually one of the core offerings of my first post-uni job, where I was, setting meetings and we had all these sort of memberships essentially for C-suite execs in different functional departments. But the thing they all loved was the benchmarking. But if I think back to it, really what that was, questionnaires, surveys, being aggregated, someone doing all the work and then presenting it back. Sure, it's useful, but how do you know that they reported it correctly versus using the data? Well,
and also, you don't need breadth of coverage, right? I mean, SAP's fortunate, right? We have 80% of global transactions that touch our systems. But you look at any major industry, the majority of those customers are in some way or form working with SAP. So we have the breadth of the industry. So we can truly say, look, in financial services, you are best in class. In utilities, you are best in class. In manufacturing, you are best in class, because, it's not one or two customers, it's hundreds or thousands of customers.
Power of sample size, basic science. And we've kind of come to it there anyway, but if the data's right and the governance is right, then you are pretty much well on your way, the theory goes, to good, effective use of AI, right? And everyone's talking about AI, but they sometimes forget those preceding steps. Marc, how have you been reacting or viewing the rollout of all the various AI tools, models, agents? Do you have a reflection of someone who's looking across the ecosystem at the moment?
I think it's a little bit the Wild West at the moment. It reminds me a little bit of IoT. When IoT sort of emerged, you need to start to see, standards emerging, right? This agentic framework idea, right? There are different competing standards which I think will need to align. But I think ultimately we need to really sort of see the business value, right? So as we think about our own use cases within SAP, we think about, what can we give to users to improve their productivity, help them with better decision making. But you also need to apply or can apply it to the technology layer. So, how do we now make sure that data is trusted? How do we align to consistent set of master data? How do we identify patterns that exist within those data sets? So, we look at it from a productivity standpoint in terms of our users and our own usage of AI. We think about it in terms of the platform capabilities that we need to deliver within Business Data Cloud as an example. And then we need to do something which is really important, is we need to ensure that data and the business context are there, right? If you don't have that association, then, you're not, I think, really delivering on the potential business value. And again, this comes back to, the requirement, I think, for a curated set of high quality data products, because they become the foundation for business AI. And this leads into some of the other partnerships that we have announced over the last sort of 12 months, which is really about now, applying that data to data science and to the data engineer and data scientist to now sort of drive additional value that support these AI use cases. So, a little bit the Wild West. We need to see some standards emerge, some really interesting use cases that we're seeing. We're applying those into our applications, but we're also making some of the tooling available to customers so that they can do their own. And then we see where the gravity is and where the value is ultimately.
Then let me take the sort of part B to throw it to you. So if all of that's going on and it's done well, what do you think the impact on end user risk professionals will be? I appreciate you might not be building all these tools, but you have such a purview because of the partners you engage with, because of the amount of teams you touch at Moody's. What do you think?
The biggest focus is around trust. And Marc touched on this before, but the way in which SAP is tackling this is, I think, is the most sophisticated way to do it, which is focusing on data first. Get the data right, get that context right, make sure it's trusted and it's accurate, and then you move into that technology application, then you get to AI. What we're seeing in the market is we're seeing this race to generative AI, to agents, to get into that autonomy, but the previous steps haven't been done as well, and it hasn't actually been lined up. So what you're getting is the output. May seem great from an efficiency standpoint. You've saved 30% of time on what you're doing as a risk analyst. But if you can't trust those building blocks, it means that there's already kind of a break in trust. And I think by starting potentially not necessarily slow, but starting right, starting at that core, which is where BDC sits with Business Data Cloud, getting that part right, then having in that business context of the applications. So this application is delivering for this problem or this job. And then if that part is working, then you apply Joule or a generative AI solution on top of it to then automate that already accurate and correct flow. And I think this is where we have so much admiration for SAP's clarity on the strategy. Everything is data, applications, AI, and it flows in that. It's the same with our project we're working on. we know that the North Star is to get to having an agentic solution, to being fully AI ready, but we want to get those core pieces right. And I think from a risk perspective, that's also what we owe our customers, because we have to stand behind our joint applications we go to market with, what we go out as a partner to say, we've done these building blocks right. And that also comes down to both Moody's and SAP. What we build, we use. And it's the SAP for SAP story, or it's the Moody's on Moody's or the Moody's on SAP story. That's an important piece too, because there's no point going out there and building a partnership and then talking to customers about it if you can't turn around and say, we use this every day.
Yeah. And it's the old adage, right? Garbage in, garbage out, right? And that applies in spades to AI, right? It comes back to the start of this conversation, right? If you can't trust in the data, how can you trust in the output of the AI? So it's critical.
I mean, I'm thinking through, again, we've talked about qualified data and as data points, I'm seeing in sort of my day job, speaking to dozens and dozens of different firms on a sort of monthly basis. There's a lot of new data sets, but they are broadly built through scraping with LLMs built on top to structure or to explain the data. And it allows you to go at tremendous speed and it allows you to go at fractional costs. But if you think about the regulated industries, and they absolute must have, they've always, the regulators have always pushed them, understand your data lineage, and you must have what is often referred to as primary source. What is the trusted source? And then if that's not available, what's the secondary most trusted source, and so on. So I think there's probably a place for this other scraped, aggregated, AI put together data, for lack of a better phrase. I need to find a better one. But it needs to be called out that this is a possible or a probable, not a definite, versus things that have been properly treated, properly standardized, properly lineaged, if that's a verb.
So make it one.
Yeah, make it one. Oxford Dictionary. I'll be on the phone. Word of the year.
You have to do Gen Z there.
Yeah. God, I'm up against it. But yeah, I think it's a key thing for people to understand, because we can get so impressed by the shiny new thing or the shiny new tool or the pace, when actually you've got to, as you're both explaining, do things in a logical order so they can be trusted.
I mean, you raise an important point, right? We think about this. I mean, I guess we're not as advanced as we need to be, but you think about the whole watermark approach that historically we've had. You almost need to apply some kind of watermarking to the model, right? Based on, essentially the accuracy of the training set, right? At the end of the day. And I think this is where, we actually believe we have an advantage as SAP, because, often we're using what I would call real data, right? This transaction happened. It happened between this customer and this individual. It was on this date for this amount. There's no generative aspect, right? It occurred. And then now you're using that, right? If you really want to spot trends, or if you really want to identify where there's, fraudulent activity or inconsistencies, then, you're not relying on a transformer function to come up with something based on an aggregation of different items, right? This occurred, right? I know for certain, right? So, we need to think through how do we sort of, watermark that to show that, look, you can have more trust in this outcome because the quality of the data is what it needs to be.
So moving on slightly, although staying with the theme, Ben, I told you I might quote Rocky in this podcast. So the coach Mickey says, we need greasy, fast speed as he gets him to chase a chicken around the little yard. For those that haven't seen that movie, I'm dating all of us. But how are you and your team working with SAP and all the teams there to make sure that we increase the speed that they can go at and increase the speed at which they can get the data right, the governance right, and then start to look at this North Star that we've talked to?
There was a statement made at the Sapphire conference for SAP, which is their annual global conference with their customers, that resonated incredibly well with our group, which was that SAP wants to empower their customers to make the world's toughest decisions within their solutions, so that if you're a CFO and you're working through the platform, you can make an informed decision when you're there. You don't need to go to another source. You don't need to leave anywhere. You can actually make it within that platform. That's exactly what customers are asking for Moody's, is that we want your insights, your intelligence, your trusted data to be where we're making these decisions. We don't want to have to leave that train of thought, that workflow, to come away, to get that insight, to get the risk insights from Moody's and then bring it back. that is where I think our partnership is coming to the fore, and customers are starting to appreciate it, is that we are meeting customers, as I mentioned earlier, we're meeting customers where they're making those decisions. So when they head down, they've got this big decision to make, whether it's from a CFO, from a risk perspective, onboarding a customer, offboarding a customer. We are there enriching that view with their customer data that sits within SAP, the benchmarking information that SAP has. And that part there is such a USP for SAP in our partnership, because they have the ability, based on the scale and the size of their customers, to be able to tell you, how is your organization performing, or how is this decision based on every other decision that's been made in that same way? So if we can bring those three elements together, it empowers that exact vision of giving customers the ability to make their hardest decisions when they're in that flow, when they're in that solution, which is the Moody's information analytics and the data, that trusted view, empowered by the SAP benchmarking, SAP customer data, all within that one platform.
You might call it integrated risk assessment.
Yeah, there you go.
Which I talk to a lot, because that's sort of a bit of a rallying cry at Moody's. So apologies.
Yeah, it's exactly right. That is the element of it, is it bringing it all into the one context, that one pane, that they can make that view and make that informed decision.
Fantastic. Last sort of main question before we properly wrap up. But Marc, SAP, as you've said, works almost across every vertical. Almost all 80% of the transactions, as you said. So is there a difference in how you think BDC would be deployed by different key verticals, or am I maybe overcomplicating this?
I mean, the applicability is there for every industry and frankly for every use case. The challenge sometimes is, as we think about security and some of the legislation and regulation that is out there, right? I think of things like, the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, right, in the US, that, puts an onus on customers in terms of, where their data can be or should be, or more importantly, where do they not want it to be, right? Because, the US sometimes, asks for data that maybe they shouldn't have access to because it at some point touched the border of the US. So I think that, where you see heavily regulated industries, it puts an additional onus, right? Sometimes we need to think through our data center strategy to ensure, okay, can we support sovereign cloud? Can we support NS2, which is our sort of US Fed type use cases? And that puts a challenge on in terms of how we can make data products available, who can have access to them. But then what's interesting is that, if I'm, Lockheed in the US, and I want to have all my data securely locked up in some sort of NS2 certified cloud, what happens when you now want to do business with British Aerospace? All theirs is in the UK, we're in the UK sovereign cloud, right? And I think this is where we need to start to think a little bit about, maybe clean room type concepts, where, one of the core strategies we have with BDC is around zero copy share. So it's about federating, making the data available, but not copying it. So, that actually maybe is a way that we can get around some of these, highly regulated requirements, where you can now, make available to that counterparty without actually moving it into their domain or moving it into their jurisdiction, which now overcomes some of the regulatory requirements. So, applicable to everyone, a little bit more challenging in, highly regulated industries like finance, public sector, and others. And, it really has an impact on the data center strategy and how you think about making the data or the data product available.
Sounds very much like the problems you'd solve are the same, but it's really a difference in deployment, difference in how you realize the value as opposed to the value that you realize.
Exactly.
And we've got our mutual partnership of Databricks that is also along this journey with us. That's we're working directly with. We're working with SAP and Databricks, but it's such an important part around having the best of breed providers coming together to try and solve these problems rather than doing it in silos. And if you keep doing it in silos, it means that your customers are having to try and think of these fabrics that you've got to try and establish. So I think by bringing in these smartest minds and having these conversations, the customers that we go to, they appreciate that we've thought about this 3 or 4 steps ahead of where they are today.
Fantastic. And the last question, really, and it's a nice way you're sort of getting there, is just what should folks that are watching this and are interested in seeing what comes out of this great partnership, what should they be looking out for over the sort of short and medium term? Mark, start with you.
I mean, firstly, availability of Moody's data across the SAP portfolio, right? And one of the things we're discussions with is how best to bring that to life for customers, right? Is this something where we want to give the customer choice, right? Where we say, okay, you want to now, enrich your customer data, or you want to enrich your supplier vendor data. Okay, we'll make Moody's accessible to you, or do we actually want to take the step up front and say, well, actually, we'll enrich the data product, right? We will go to a best in class vendor. We will do that work on your behalf, Mr. Customer. Trust in us that we're providing you now with a faster time to value, hopefully a better outcome for the business. So there are some things we need to work through in terms of what's the right model. Customers will have different preferences. We want to try to be as flexible as possible. But it's that availability of keyring and the enriched data sets that we want to make sure are easily available and accessible to our broad customer base, so that they can now sort of deliver value from that.
Then anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, echoing Mark's points around ensuring that we're listening to the customer. So we're not sitting internally and asking what is going to be best for us to build. We're actually listening to our end customers, and we've worked really well together already on our first project, and we'll be able to announce that in October, November of this year together. But it's just proof that when you have two organizations that are so aligned on the end goal of empowering our customers with trust and accuracy as to how quickly these things can move. And both Moody's and SAP are fairly large organizations. Obviously, SAP is the colossal, but the speed and the velocity we've seen in this space working with BDC has really opened our eyes as to what the art of possible is for the end of 26, for example. And I think just watch this space, because we've got some of our brightest minds dedicated to the SAP partnership. SAP's done the exact same back, and I think in the next 3 to 6 months, there's going to be some amazing things that we bring to market.
I think that's the first time we've ever been called quick. So thanks for that, Ben.
Well, I'll take that as a quick introduction to mind my business to October, and then we'll get very excited. I'm sure there'll be lots of LinkedIn Reels and other things. But guys, thank you so much for coming in, explaining some of the things that are going on in data, in AI, in the partnership itself. And really excited to see where Business Data Cloud and Moody's go together.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, bye.